is under attack. Building.
Vehicle affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Insufficient funds.
Acknowledge. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very well. Report acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
prepared.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Very well. Ready and agree. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Waiting
lost.
orders. Acknowledged.
Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Prepared. Unit
Awaiting
prepared.
orders.
10 minutes.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting order. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Vehicle
Building.
reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
lost.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle
Affirmative.
reporting.
Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Warning. 5 minutes. remaining.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Prepared.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Waiting order.
Affirmative.
Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit prepared.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Warning.
Acknowledged.
4 minutes remaining. Preparing. Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit prepared. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Preparing.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
prepared.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Preparing.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged.
Warning. 3 minutes remaining.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Our base is under
Acknowledged.
attack. Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Warning. 2 minutes remaining. Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. 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 Awaiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Warning.
Acknowledged.
1
Acknowledged.
minute remaining.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Waiting. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Convoy approaching.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Building. Training. Unit ready. Training. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Training.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Very affirmative. At once.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting orders. Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Training. Unit ready.
Vehicle
Affirmative.
reporting.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative. Reporting. Knowledge. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge.
Convoy approaching. Silos needed.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Silos needed. Building.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Silos needed.
Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Vehicle. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Waiting orders.
ready.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge.
Building.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Prepared.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
prepared.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Reporting.
Convoy
Acknowledged.
approaching.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Vehicle.
Soviet
Affirmative.
reinforcements have arrived.
Affirmative. Yes,
Soviet
sir.
reinforcements have
Affirmative.
arrived.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Vehicle acknowledged.
Building.
Reporting.
Soviet
Yes,
reinforcements
sir.
have
Affirmative.
arrived.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Soviet
Acknowledge.
reinforcements have arrived.
Affirmative.
Our base is under attack.
Reporting.
Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Reporting.
lost.
At once. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Waiting.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Convoy
Acknowledged.
approaching.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Report. Affirmative.
Unit
Vehicle
lost.
reporting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Knowledge. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Agreed. Of course. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, affirmative.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well.
Building. Training.
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Unit ready.
and wait. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Training.
Vehicle.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Reporting. Ready and waiting. Agreed. Very well.
Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Reporting. Very well.
Unit lost.
Ready and waiting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. At once.
Building.
At once.
Unit lost.
At once.
Waiting orders.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Waiting
Convoy
affirmative.
approaching. Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Unit
sir.
lost.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Waiting affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Our base is under
Affirmative.
attack.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Prepared. Unit prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Convoy approaching. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Ready and waiting. Yes, sir. Very well.
Building.
Agreed. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Agreed.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready. Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Awaiting order.
Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged.
Convoy approaching. Building.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready
Unit
and waiting.
lost.
Very well. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Reporting.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building. Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Vehicle. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes,
Unit
sir.
lost. Mission accomplished.